So tone is in the gear. That statement's about 30 to 40% true, but it's something that's probably more percent than we often hear as guitar players, which is that tone is in the fingers, tone is in the hands, that the greats can make any kind of gear sound amazing. Kind of. I imagine if you hear some of your heroes playing through some horrible, horrible sounding gear, it'll sound like them with horrible sound. It won't be their signature sound that they're able to make. So I'd love to have that conversation about tone being in the gear. Now I have a couple guitars, not a ton. I have a few, but I have one that I know is my gets the job done guitar. I love it. I think it sounds really good, but I also know that if anything happens to it, I will be able to replace it confidently and quickly, and I won't even mind working on it myself. And then I have a couple that are either so sentimental, I have one that's so sentimental, or a couple that I'm much more nervous about with their fragility. One of them happens to be my opposite of a get it done guitar, this needs to go perfectly. One of those is my needs to go perfectly guitar, and I can always trust if I end up plugging into anything, if anything goes wrong, I'll be able to make it work. Love that thing. But if anything happens to it, I will be so crushed and it gives me a little bit of anxiety. And I have one that I can trust that I also feel comfortable fixing. For instance, there was a long time, I think it was like, I had one guitar for about 7 years. This guitar right here. Eric Johnson Signature Strat. I had this guitar for a long time. You can see it's kind of aged just over time because it's a nitro finish. But this was it. I made this work. I experienced music through this one guitar, and that is it. I learned about this one in New York, where I was playing with different backline all the time. Because I had an amp that was insanely heavy that I think I brought to a gig once and was like, this is insane. And then I just used the backline. Backlines, on the other hand, I found out over the years, could change radically, and there is no standard. Or there wasn't. I have no idea what it's like now. But, one day it'll be this amp, and then at the same venue 3 weeks later, it's a completely different amp. Or that this venue, there's a half-stack Marshall, a solid-state half-stack Marshall, and then a Fender Twin, and then like a practice amp. And you walk on stage and go, oof, and you just plug in and go. Now, I found out with the Eric Johnson that a lot of the times the tone wildly changed. And I'd be playing kind of the marriage between the amp and the guitar, as opposed to having a consistent sound no matter what I plugged into. After moving to LA, quite a guitar town, I was exposed to so many different guitars and so many more interesting maybe boutique brands, which at the time when I moved here, like about 5 years ago, I had never heard of Sir. And then I started playing some, and I got a Strat, a Sir S guitar. And it was amazing. It was everything that I ever played in a Fender, except all these little kinks were worked out. And what I noticed is any amp I kind of plugged it into, it would basically sound like it. And it became something I would say playing the amp versus playing the pickups. Is, the EJ, if I plug it into something, it might sound different, radically different. The Sir S style, I plug it into anything, it would basically sound like it, which I loved because all of a sudden I was one step closer to having consistency in sound. Another thing I found is the amps in New York would handle my pedals differently. And I had no experience with this because, again, I liked my guitar. It was so close to my heart because it had anything to do with Eric Johnson. Eric Johnson's my favorite guy. And I had my hot rod, the Fender amp, which was fine. And but what I realized playing through all these different amps is, again, the guitar would sound differently, and also the pedals would sound differently. Sometimes I'd have a ton of gain, sometimes I'd have none. Sometimes it'd be really clear, and sometimes it'd be kind of muffled. I had no idea why that was going on. Since then, I've learned a lot about amps, but it was only once I got to LA and I went on a tour that my amp wasn't treated as well as I would have liked it to have been. So for the next tour, I got a AX8, a Fractal AX8. And since then, I probably didn't use it on that tour to its fullest extent, but since then I've learned a lot and gotten to experience a lot of different amps and cabinets. And gotten to understand, what makes each special, what makes each which ones work with different guitars, etc. What I've also understood is the level of amps which I bought, which are maybe mid-level, I guess. They sound this good, very solid. I like them a lot. This good. The amps that I'm modeling are super boutique. They're Friedman or a CAE Plus, custom audio electronic something, and then next to a Super Reverb, and then next to a Dr. Z, and then next to, whatever. These amps sound this good. And if you were the kind of person who says, well, amp modelers only sound 90% as good or 80% as good as a real amp. Well, my real amp sounds this good. My modelers sound this good. The amps I'm modeling sound this good. If you take that 20%, it still sounds better, honestly. The amps I'm modeling have more character to them, have more flavor to them than the amps that I bought, unfortunately. So I've found in that I'm able to have an incredibly consistent sound, and I'm able to have a lot of control over my tone, and I'm able to have each song I'm playing maybe sound a bit different, maybe have a certain amount of amps that sit in the mix of certain songs and deal with the parts of certain songs easier or better than if I was to play through with my Eric Johnson through like a Champ or something and I'm playing like a hard rock song. It's not going to go well. So, but with the Fractal, I'm able to just go, oops, hard rock amp, ooh, back to this thing, oops, switch amp. So I've been able to end up learning a lot about tone and how my own gear ends up sitting much more in the mix of each of these songs, ends up reflecting in the parts much, much more than when I was bitten by the a good guitarist can make anything sound good bug and tried to fit in that mold. So, and some people say like, well, the greats, you could hear them, they could play through anything. They could play through anything and you know who they are. I guess. If you put like a active pickup RG in Hendrix's hands and he went through the PA, yeah, I guess you could probably make it work. It sure wouldn't sound the same. If you put it in, Stevie Ray Vaughan's hands, again, it would sound like Stevie Ray Vaughan's playing this other gear. It wouldn't sound 100% crystallized identity. It would sound like two differing identities. And you're like, well, it's all in their fingers, though. Finger tone is really important. What you're hearing mostly is their style, but okay, finger tone is important. I don't have huge hands or anything like that, but if I play on the pad of my finger versus the point of my finger, you're right. It'll be slightly thicker tone, slightly brighter tone. Sure, because this is touching my bone, I guess. That being said, if I'm playing a jazz box through like a Yamaha keyboard amp, it's going to be dark. And if I'm playing a bridge pickup on a Telecaster through a Fender amp, it's going to be super bright, no matter where my finger tone is. So at a certain point, it's going to end up being a marriage. If I started to think of my gear as an extension of my hands and finger tone, then it started to make sense. I might play something and I might play a certain way that certain guitars and certain gear kind of made for it. I might play really lightly. Then I won't want really low output pickups going through a low gain amp. I might want, or if I do, I might want more compression or something. If I play really heavy, I might not want to just constantly be distorting my signal with like a high output pickup or something like that. If you start to think of tone as just what's in your head, but you can't control it as you can your hands, you can only just use it. but it's still a part of your visualization of your sound, then it becomes a much more healthy relationship. It's less, well, a good guitarist can make anything sound good, and the tones in the hands and gear is irrelevant, and all those other stupid arguments. If you just try to use it as like, how do I want to be? How do I want to sound? Let me do some research. Okay, great. Let me give this a shot. Let me educate myself. And then let me put that tone out there and use it a lot and try to explore it. Then that's about as great of a relationship as you can have. You won't end up with crazy gear acquisition syndrome, crazy gas, and you won't end up basically not learning out of pride. So this isn't like a plug for fractal units or anything like that, but I would highly recommend either a fractal or Line 6 or whatever, as a way to educate yourself on so many of the different options and how they relate to your guitar and how they might relate to your playing. And then play so many songs and play in all these different kinds of bands and use that gear and try to make it as flexible as you can possibly make it. And then you might realize, oh, tone's a little bit in the gear. Thank you very much for watching. Really appreciate it. Please comment below, and I'll see you next week.